Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and Sophomore English. We are in Unit number 2. Please have your hymnals open to 238, 239 and following. We're going to begin with a short story, William Melvin Kelley's text, A Visit to Grandmother. Before we get there though, let's write this down because we're going to come back to it. Characterization. We're going to talk about two different forms of characterization. By the way, you're taking notes now at 2B. Two different forms of characterization. On page 239. The first is what we call direct characterization. Make sure you've got the definition. The writer tells readers exactly what the character is like. For example, Hugo is generous to a fault. Indirect characterization, make sure you've got this one in your notes. The writer reveals a character's traits through dialogue, the character's words, the character's actions and thoughts, and the interactions between the character and others. To better understand characters and get insight into the theme of a story, take note of the character development, let's put that one in our notes, changes a complex character undergoes, or new aspects of the character the writer will reveal. By the way, we as well will begin to make inferences. This is an important one for our reading skill. A logical assumption based on details in a story. Making inferences helps you more fully understand story characters and the reasons that they act as they do. To make inferences about a character, relate characters and events to your own experience, what we call, of course, 3B, and make assumptions based on that information. For example, if a story character mumbles and avoids eye contact, you may think of people you know who act this way, and you may infer that the character is shy. You do have a chart that can inference chart that can help you at the bottom of page 239. On 240, remember your vocab words. You want to make sure that you're working with those. And again, of course, our big question is, can progress be made without conflict? So let's put this in our notes right away. We're going to be paying attention, obviously, to the conflict. Hey, let's meet William Melvin Kelley, born in 1937, a man of questions. Are you reading with me on 241? He says, quote, "I'm not a sociologist or a politician or a spokesman. Such people try to give answers. A writer, I think, should ask questions." Kelley's questions often explore the problems of belonging to a group. His first novel, A Different Drummer, reflects his belief in individualism. Also a community artist, notice your heading. At the same time, Kelley's work shows a strong connection to community. He belongs to the Black Arts Movement, the generation of writers, artists, dancers, and musicians that emerged in the 1960s and 70s. Like others in the movement, he often addresses the moral, cultural, and political questions African Americans face. Introducing his class on writing fiction, Kelley once noted, quote, "Art may come from the heart, but craft comes from the brain," end quote. Our last, for background of the story, is dialect. Write this one down in 2B. Dialect is the variety of a language spoken in a region or community. Some characters in A Visit to Grandmother speak in a southern dialect. In this dialect, I reckon means I believe. Fixin' to replaces about to. Okay, so we're going to pay attention to some of this dialect stuff as we get into the story. All right, here we go. William Melvin Kelley. Now, before we begin, I just want to point this out because some of you are already kind of scanning, as good readers do as a sophomore, scanning the story and starting to think a little bit about this whole issue of length of text. So let's address it really quickly. In our sophomore year, we have identifiably longer texts, more demanding texts. Now, they're not necessarily always more demanding intellectually. Sometimes they are. But they certainly are longer. What's the value of this for us? Our assessment and our testing that's coming requires of us. Again, we said on the ACT, a 3-hour reading test. So we've got to make sure that we are capable of concentrating, focusing for the amount of time necessary. And here you have an opportunity to do that very thing. Pay attention as your mind wanders. Bring it back to the reading at hand. Try to do your best to follow along and actually read. Hey, can I say this out loud? I said this to you when you were a freshman as well. By the age of 5, 6, you could sit on your little rug in front of the teacher, and the teacher could read the story to you, and you could listen to the story being read to you and know what was going on. That, by the way, is an important skill set development. That is not what we are doing here now. Your job is to be reading along with the reader. Don't just let the reader tell you the story. Read along with the reader. And again, if you're having challenges with staying up with the reader, then recognizing some sentence fluidity issues may be something we need to work on. So here we go. A Visit to Grandmother, a fascinating story about conflict. Let's pay attention, see what we think.
A Visit to Grandmother by William Melvin Kelley. Chig knew something was wrong the instant his father kissed her. He had always known his father to be the warmest of men, a man so kind that when people ventured timidly into his office, it took only a few words from him to make them relax and even laugh. Dr. Charles Dunford cared about people, but when he had bent to kiss the old lady's black face, something new and almost ugly had come into his eyes. Fear, uncertainty, sadness, and perhaps even hatred. 10 days before in New York, Chig's father had decided suddenly he wanted to go to Nashville to attend his college class reunion 20 years out. Both Chig's brother and sister, Peter and Connie, were packing for camp and besides were too young for such an affair. But Chig was 17, had nothing to do that summer, and his father asked if he would like to go along. His father had given him additional reasons. All my running buddies got their diplomas and were snapped up by them crafty young gals, and had kids within a year. Now all those kids, some of them gals, are your age. The reunion had lasted a week. As they packed for home, his father, in a far too offhand way, had suggested they visit Chig's grandmother. We're this close, we might as well drop in on her and my brothers.
244.
So instead of going north, they had gone farther south, had just entered her house. And Chig had a suspicion now that the reunion had been only an excuse to drive south, that his father had been heading to this house all the time. His father had never talked much about his family, with the exception of his brother, G.L., who seemed part con man, part practical joker, and part Don Juan. He had spoken of G.L. with the kind of indulgence he would have shown a cute but ill-behaved and potentially dangerous 5-year-old. Chig's father had left home when he was 15. When asked why, he would answer, "I wanted to go to school. They didn't have a Negro high school at home, so I went up to Knoxville and lived with a cousin and went to school." They had been met at the door by Aunt Rose, G.L.'s wife, and ushered into the living room. The old lady had looked up from her seat by the window. Aunt Rose stood between the visitors. The old lady eyed his father. "Rose? Who that? Rose?" She squinted. She looked like a doll made of black straw, the wrinkles in her face running in one direction like the head of a broom. Her hair was white and coarse and grew out straight from her head. Her eyes were brown. The whites, too, seemed light brown and were hidden behind thick glasses which remained somehow on a tiny nose. "That Hiram?" That was another of his father's brothers. "No, it ain't Hiram. Too big for Hiram." She turned then to Chig. "Now, that man, he looked like Eleanor, Charles's wife, but Charles would never send my grandson to see me. I never even hear from Charles." She stopped again. "It Charles, Mama. That who it is?" Aunt Rose, between them, led them closer. "It Charles come all the way from New York to see you and brung little Charles with him." The old lady stared up at them. "Charles? Rose, that really Charles?" She turned away and reached for a handkerchief in the pocket of her clean, ironed, flowered housecoat and wiped her eyes. "God have mercy, Charles." She spread her arms up to him, and he bent down and kissed her cheek. That was when Chig saw his face, grimacing. She hugged him. Chig watched the muscles in her arms as they tightened around his father's neck. She half rose out of her chair. "How are you, son?"
Now we're going to pause for a moment. Level 1. We called this last year when we were studying our Homer, in medias res. That is to say, you begin in the middle of the action. Notice that that's how this story begins. At first, you kind of are a little bit lost when the opening line of the story, flip back one page, begins with, Chig knew something was wrong the instant his father kissed her. And you don't know who Chig is. And the young 17-year-old boy that's going along with his father to this reunion. And you don't know who the her is. Obviously, it's going to be ultimately his own grandmother, the mother of his father. And yet, it brings us into the story. Now, all of a sudden, we got some of the backstory. We're down in Tennessee. We're visiting a grandma that Chig has never met before, and that his father, Charles, has never come back to visit. So we've got some tension. Write it down already at 2B. What is the inherent, clear conflict that's going on right now already in the story? Notice how grandmother, for Chig, that is to say Charles's mother, is going to respond, right? Notice she already said, well, clearly it isn't Charles. Charles never comes back to visit. Also at 2B, jot down, notice our already use of dialect, right? In the dialogue, there is dialect. That is going to give you a sense that we are further south in America, in the nation of America, where the dialect's going to change a little bit. All right, now that you know there's a bit of tension that's set up, let's find out where this story leads us.
Chig could not hear his father's answer. She let him go and fell back into her chair, grabbing the arms. Her hands were as dark as the wood and seemed to become part of it. Now, who that standing there? Who that man?
245.
That's one of your grandsons, Mama. His father's voice cracked. Charles Dunford Jr. You saw him once when he was a baby in Chicago. He's grown now. I can see that boy. She looked at Chig squarely. Come here, son, and kiss me once. He did. What'd they call you? Charles, too? No, ma'am, they call me Chig. She smiled. She had all her teeth, but they were too perfect to be her own. That's good. Can't have two boys answering to Charles in the same house. Won't nobody at all come. So you, that little boy, you don't remember me, do you? I used to take you to church in Chicago, and you'd get up and hop in time to the music. You studying to be a preacher? No, ma'am, I don't think so. I might be a lawyer. You'll be an honest one, won't you? I'll try. Trying ain't enough. You be honest, you hear? Promise me. You be honest like your daddy. All right, I promise. Good. Rose, where's GL at? Where's that thief? He gone again? I don't know, Mama. Aunt Rose looked embarrassed. He say he was going by the store. He'll be back. Well then, where's Hiram? You call up those boys and get them over here now. You got enough to eat? Let me go see. She started to get up. Chig reached out his hand. She shook him off. What'd they tell you about me, Chig? They tell you I'm all laid up? Don't believe it. They don't know nothing about old ladies. When I want help, I'll let you know. Only time I'll need help getting anywheres is when I dies and they lift me into the ground. She was standing now, her back and shoulders straight. She came only to Chig's chest. She squinted up at him. You eat much? Your daddy ate like two men. Oh, yes, ma'am. That's good. That means you ain't nervous. Your mama, she ain't nervous. I remember that. In Chicago, she'd sit down by the window all afternoon and never say nothing. Just knit. She smiled. Let me see what we got to eat. I'll do that, Mama. Aunt Rose spoke softly. You haven't seen Charles in a long time. You sit and talk. The old lady squinted at her. You can do the cooking if you promise it ain't because you think I can't. Aunt Rose chuckled. I know you can do it, Mama. All right, I'll just sit and talk a spell.
Let's pause for a moment. Let's jot it down at level 1 just because we can get a brief observation here. Grandma, what do we want to say about her? 1, opinionated, right? In other words, she's going to tell you what she thinks. Whether you solicit it or not, she's going to tell you what she thinks. 2, demanding. Do you notice this? The way in which she makes demands on people. And of course, if this is how she is when she's old, you can infer what about this woman when she was younger and she was raising Chig's father, Charles. 3, independent. Notice when she starts to get out of the chair, the young 17-year-old boy steps over to help her. And she's like, I'll tell you if I need help. Stand out of my way. And of course, he's like, whoa, 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 right? This is his first real meeting. I mean, he knew her when he was younger, but he didn't really know her. This is his first real meeting. And notice the way that he's studying her is, whoa, what kind of woman is this? Notice she's a take charge woman. All right, it's time to get ready. Let's go. Let's start talking about food. Notice here it's, hey, just take it easy. Enjoy Charles. He's back. He's visiting. You haven't seen him for a long time. He's your son. Let's try and figure it out. Now, let's write this down at level 1. Obviously, we know there's something in the history of this family. Let's write that down. The question is obvious. Notice we said this about our author. He loves to write texts that make us ask questions. The obvious question we have right now is, what's the history of this family, right? That has gone on way in the past, that still has some kind of relevance, yes, to the way this family dynamic unfolds. Let's continue to try and see if we can get an answer to this question. What's going on in this family?
She sat again and arranged her skirt around her short legs. Chig did most of the talking, told all about himself before she asked. His father only spoke when he was spoken to, and then only one word at a time, as if by coming back home he had become a small boy again, sitting in the parlor while his mother spoke with her guests. When Uncle Hiram and May, his wife, came, they sat down to eat. Chig did not have to ask about Uncle G.L.'s absence. Aunt Rose volunteered an explanation. Can't never tell where the man is at. One Thursday morning, he left here, and next thing we knew, he was calling from Chicago saying he went up to see Joe Louis fight. He'll be here, though. He ain't as young and footloose as he used to be. Chig's father had mentioned driving down that G.L. was about 5 years older than he was, nearly 50. Uncle Hiram was somewhat smaller than Chig's father. His short-cropped, kinky hair was half gray, half black. One spot just off his forehead was totally white. Later, Chig found out it had been that way since he was 20. May, Chig could not bring himself to call her aunt, was a good deal younger than Hiram, pretty enough so that Chig would have looked at her twice on the street. She was a honey-colored woman with long eyelashes. She was wearing a white sheath. At dinner, Chig and his father sat on one side, opposite Uncle Hiram and May. His grandmother and Aunt Rose sat at the ends. The food was good. There was a lot, and Chig ate a lot. All through the meal, they talked about the family as it had been 30 years before, and particularly about the young G.L. May and Chig asked questions. The old lady answered. Aunt Rose directed the discussion, steering the old lady on to the best stories. Chig's father laughed from time to time. Uncle Hiram ate. Why don't you tell them about the horse, Mama? Aunt Rose, over Chig's weak protest, was spooning mashed potatoes onto his plate. There now, Chig.
248.
I'm trying to think. The old lady was holding her fork halfway to her mouth, looking at them over her glasses. Oh, you talking about that crazy horse G.L. brung home that time? That's right, Mama. Aunt Rose nodded and slid another slice of white meat on Chig's plate. May started to giggle. Oh, I've heard this. This is funny, Chig. The old lady put down her fork and began. Well, G.L. went out of the house one day with an old, no-good chair I wanted him to take over to the church for a bazaar, and he met up with this man who'd just brung in some horses from out west. Now, I reckon you can expect one swindler to be in every town, but you don't rightly think there'll be two, and God forbid they should ever meet. But they did. G.L. and his chair, this man and his horses. Well, I wished I'd have been there. There must have been some mighty high-powered talking going on. That man with his horses, he told G.L. them horses was half Arab, half Indian. And G.L. told that man the chair was an antique he'd stole from some rich white folks. So they swapped. Well, I was looking out the window and seen GL dragging this animal to the house. It looked pretty gentle, and its eyes was most closed, and its feet was shuffling. GL, where'd you get that thing? I says. I swapped him for that old chair, Mama, he says, and made myself a bargain. This is even better than Papa's horse. Well, I'm a-looking at this horse and noticing how he be looking more and more wide awake every minute, sort of warming up like a tea kettle until I swears to you that horse is blowing steam out its nose. Come on, Mama, GL says, come on, I'll take you for a ride. Now, George, my husband, God rest his tired soul, he brung home this white folks' buggy, which had a busted wheel, and fixed it and was to take it back that day, and GL says, come on, Mama, we'll use this fine buggy and take us a ride. GL, I says, no, we ain't. Them white folks will burn us alive if we use their buggy. You just take that horse right on back. You see, I was sure that boy'd come by that animal ungainly. Mama, I can't take him back, GL says. Why not, I says. Because I don't rightly know where that man is at, GL says. Oh, I says, well then I reckon we stuck with it. And I turned around to go back into the house because it was getting late, near dinner time, and I was cooking for 10. Mama, GL says to my back, Mama, ain't you coming for a ride with me?
249.
Go on, boy, you ain't getting me inside kicking range of that animal. I was eyeing that beast, and it was boiling hotter all the time. I reckon maybe that man had drugged it. That horse is wild, GL, I says. No, he ain't. He ain't. That man says he is buggy and saddle broke, and as sweet as the inside of an apple. My oldest girl, Essie, had to come out on the porch, and she says, go on, Mama, I'll cook. You ain't been out the house in weeks. Sure, come on, Mama, GL says. There ain't nothing to be fidgety about. This horse is gentle as a rose petal. And just then that animal snorts so hard it sets up a